The Fordist Security State and New Social Movements by Joachim Hirsch. Section 1. This essay deals mainly with the possibility for a further development of Marxist political theory that has been stagnating in West Germany since the end of the so-called state derivation debate. It presents a very abridged version of the propositions and results of my book, Der Sicherheitsstaat, from 1980, which combined the structuralist categories of state derivation with a theory of the historical development of capitalist society. This combination has enabled me to proceed from general and therefore abstract political theory to a concept useful for the analysis of actual changes in the political apparatus, essential for the political usefulness and relevance of theory. This essay is also bound to a political problematic that is to some degree specific to the West German political scene, the transformation of the Social Democratic Party from a reformist worker-based organization to a highly bureaucratized state party, the emergence of an authoritarian non-liberal political form, the growth of surveillance apparatuses, and the failure of the traditional workers' movement. Emerging at the same time were new forms of social movements and social conflicts, such as the environmental movement, the feminist movement, and the so-called, quote, alternative movement, which did not fit into the traditional Marxist scheme. At the beginning of this development in the 60s, the Marxist debate was highly concentrated around a critique of ideology aimed at uncovering the material foundations of prevailing illusions of a class-neutral state and at explaining the ongoing transformation of the liberal democratic system. Ironically, all this happened not only under a conservative but under a social democratic regime. Ironically, all this happened not under a conservative but under a social democratic regime. The West German, quote, so-called state derivation debate is mainly located within this context. The shortcoming of this theoretical approach is that it focuses almost exclusively on the general structural characteristics of a capitalist society. It is therefore unable to account for some of the fundamental historical transformations of this society, the changes in the form of surplus production, of class structure, of internationalization of capital, and of societalization in general. The present outline tries to determine the political structure during the, quote, Fordist phase of capitalist development, which mainly established itself after World War II. This phase is marked by an intensified mode of capital accumulation and a change to the production of relative surplus value. It is based on tailorized mass production of durable consumer goods, e.g., Henry Ford's assembly line automobile production, relatively high wages, the emergence of a sharp polarization between skilled and de-skilled, quote, tailorized, end quote, labor, expanded state intervention, including a high degree of administrative regulation of the reproduction of labor, social security, health, education. Fordism thus denotes a secular long wave of expanded capitalist accumulation by which the reproduction of labor becomes a central sphere of the valorization of capital. A consequence of this is a sharp, thorough capitalization of the whole society, commodity form of social relations, individualization, and social disintegration. Politically, this includes the emergence of social reformism, Keynesianism, and mass regulative bureaucracies. Fordism, therefore, refers to more than a form of material production and reproduction as Taylorism does. It is a historically distinct form of capitalist social formation with its own economic, political, and ideological characteristics. At present, Fordism is faced with a deep economic and political crisis. The aspects of this crisis and the political structure that might develop out of a, quote, neo-Fordist, end quote, mode of socialization will be discussed separately. Section 2. In order to understand the current changes concerning the state's character, one must keep in mind that although the fundamental structures of capitalism have been historically consistent, several changes or modifications have occurred in the mode of production within this formation. The historical reality of capitalism cannot be understood as a mere existence of a structure, but as a process of realizing this structure. This process has not come to an end yet and will not end as long as capitalism exists. Therefore, the bourgeois state, can only be referred to in a very abstract way. A theory of the state has to be based on a historical theory of the formation of society and its changes. Such a theory does not exist in a developed form. Even Marx's criticism of political economy can only be seen as a basis for that. Regarding contemporary Marxist thought, it seems reasonable to use some approaches concerning the internationalization of capital as developed within the French debate. See Aglietta, Payot, Lippietz, and Davis. In this debate, there is no theory of the state in a strict sense, but an analysis dealing with Marx's theory of accumulation and crisis concerning secular trends and conditions of production, reproduction, and socialization. This can be helpful for an analysis of the state and thus will be described briefly. Basically, we must start from the principle that capital can never reproduce itself under identical social conditions. Due to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, capital is continually forced to reverse this trend. As shown by Marx, the dynamics of relative surplus value production are essential in maintaining exploitation. This is not only a permanent development of the forces of production, but also at the same time a thorough revolution of social structures within the capitalist way of production. In particular, there is a permanent capitalization of all spheres of life, a revolution of the division of labor on a world scale, and a generalization of wage labor. This results, for example, in the abolition of handicraft and home production and of pre-capitalist ways of life and social relations with forced mobility and urbanization. Production mainly for individual need is replaced on an expanding scale by goods and services produced by means of the capitalist system. This results in a commercialization of social relationships as the way of life becomes mainly determined by commercial offers for goods and services. Moreover, the capitalist rhythm of time and work discipline become dominant factors in the sphere of reproduction. The context of socialization in advanced metropolitan capitalism, which in French theory is called Fordism, results from the forced development of capital due to crises and class struggle. It is mainly based on the fact that the tailorized production of mass commodities has become an important sphere of realization for capital, that social work take on the form of wage labor, and that material and psychic reproduction become further dependent on capitalistically produced goods and services. Only prevalent in Western Europe since the middle of the 20th century, this development has been an essential precondition for a high increase in labor productivity, for a relative decrease in the value of labor power, and the resulting long-term stability of the rate of profit. The social consequences of this mode of accumulation can hardly be overemphasized. This resulted in a tendency toward a thorough social disintegration throughout many different social spheres. The destruction of traditional ways of production and ways of life replaced a well-functioning social community by a conglomeration of isolated and atomized workers and consumers. The desolation of the suburbs can be taken as an example. Forced geographical and professional mobility, together with permanent de- and requalification processes, led to a disintegration of relationships concerning neighborhood, profession, and kinship. The intensification of work, together with simultaneous structural unemployment, caused social marginalization, such as constant unemployment, pressure into peripheral labor markets, sickness, and a forced dropping out of the achievement-oriented society. The nuclear family, isolated and at the same time overburdened with compensatory emotional demands, not only lost its ability to secure material reproduction for old age and sickness, the nuclear family also failed as an agency of socialization to help adolescents come to terms with their increasingly difficult roles as flexible and usable workers and consumers. This indicates an essential difference from previous phases of capitalist development. At the beginning of industrialization, capital could evolve by growing into existing, quote, pre-capitalist, end quote, social structures and environmental conditions. Rural population as a reservoir for labor, family as social security, nature as a free force of production. By developing further, capital dissolves and destroys these free conditions. This means that the establishment of basic conditions of production of man and nature must become a concern of organized social regulation. This is illustrated by the replacement of traditional forms of family, neighborhood, or community-based social reproduction, such as self-help in the case of sickness or unemployment, or the care for children or the elderly by social security systems, pension schemes, hospitals, schools, and the whole network of commercialized or bureaucratic social and therapeutic services. Another example is the growing necessity of state regulation of the exploitation of natural resources such as water and air. This concerns the provision of the material context of reproduction, where not only the process of immediate realization has to be politically regulated and administered, but also to a large extent the reproduction of the labor force. In this case, the network of social security certainly does not have the character of a benefit, but is rather a structural necessity due to the changed conditions of socialization. Therefore, the welfare state is not only a result of class struggle, but is also a structural constituent of the Fordist form of socialization. In a similar way, this is also true for the social adjustment of individuals and their social conditioning and the prevention of, quote, deviance, end quote, with the help of a host of bureaucratic means. The genesis of the modern education system under tight political control can be taken as an example to demonstrate this relation. Social disintegration and the establishment of wage labor require a special controlling agency that not only teaches certain qualifications, but also controls the social conditioning of adolescents. As family, community, and neighborhood lose their influence, they are replaced by institutions such as police, school, and social work. Further, capitalist development leads to a disintegration of social relationships that formerly were founded and maintained in a quasi-natural way by the market and traditional ways of life. They now have to be generated by bureaucratic control and regulation. This is the most essential basis for the, quote, Fordist security state, end quote. It is a security state in a double sense, as it guarantees both the material survival of its social members as well as their functional adjustment and regulation, their social conditioning and surveillance. Inherent in this development is the enormous extension of the central bureaucratic network of regulation, supervision, and control. With the help of these controlling agencies, the state apparatus extends deeper into the social organism and connects closer to the social structure. This, quote, statification, end quote, of society is the other side of Fordist disintegration. Therefore, not accidentally, the so-called crisis of the family is followed by an increasing network of helping and punishing, educating and supervising institutions, from social work to juvenile police, from schools to courts. The historical emergence of the security state in that double sense as, quote, welfare state and, quote, surveillance state within the advanced capitalist countries, however, has developed in a highly uneven fashion. It is more developed in Western Europe, especially in West Germany, than in the United States or Japan. This is due to differences in a whole series of historical conditions, the traditional predominance of the state administration, the form and intensity of class conflicts, the political organization of labor, and the availability of natural resources, and so on. A decisive factor in this uneven development could be the relatively weak position of the East European countries within the context of inter-imperialistic competition after World War I. This forced a strong state-organized development of productive forces, including the reproduction of labor and the regulation of social conflict. The term security state, therefore, means a mode of social organization which cannot be sufficiently described by traditional terms such as, quote, interventionist state or, quote, welfare state. It is less true now than ever that the state intervenes from the outside into an otherwise self-regulating process. To imagine such a relation between the state and society already is an anachronism. The state has become an essential moment of operation and a central component of social reproduction, penetrating society in all its divisions. This also means that traditional political and state institutions have undergone profound changes in character as well as in social meaning. Today, parliament, state bureaucracies, and social and political parties do not represent what they did several decades ago. To summarize what has been said so far, in order to secure the realization of capital, the need to capitalize society is inherent in the historical process of accumulation. This does not mean a development of the forces of production in capitalist terms. It also requires a profound change in the division of labor in class relations and generally in social relations. Within the capitalist framework, therefore, we have to acknowledge a change in the mode of production. It is based on the destruction of the natural as well as the social conditions of capitalist production. To attain these conditions in capitalist terms, a social organization, a particular form of state, is now necessary. The resulting statification of society changes the state's character thoroughly, as the state no longer can be regarded as a repressive and ideological superstructure. The state becomes a main constituent of the, quote, basis, end quote, of social life itself. This also means, however, that old ideas of revolutionary, quote, destruction, end quote, of the state have to be revised. The process of revolution has to be thought of in a different way. At the same time, old notions which previously described forms of the bourgeois state, such as parliamentarism, fascism, etc., are no longer sufficient. The, quote, security state, end quote, has emerged from a new form in history. In a certain sense, the security state is simultaneously a post-fascist and a post-democratic state, and therefore a class struggle is now taking place within a very different arena. Section 3. This process of historical change in the capitalist mode of socialization has to be taken into account in order to understand the autonomization of the state or the organization of capitalist class relations via the state apparatus, and to realize the resulting contradictions that are politically relevant. It is very difficult, however, to combine the propositions of the growing, quote, statification, end quote, of society with the concept of, quote, autonomization, end quote, in the state derivation debate. As Palancis has emphasized and the West German state derivation debate has carried out, the, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, of the state apparatus, respectively, the state apparatus's, quote, partialization, end quote, is a fundamental presupposition of the reproduction of every capitalist society. Only each partialized state apparatus is able to produce the general prerequisites of capitalist production and reproduction outside the immediate sphere of competition and exploitation. This means that the state apparatus cannot have fixed connections or an identity with particular classes or class fractions. The theory of state monopoly capitalism has its greatest error in this point. The tendency of statification, that is, the penetration of society with state or quasi-state apparatuses, seems to be in contradiction with that structural necessity. However, this should not be seen as an inadequacy of theory, but as an expression of contradictory social tendencies that must manifest themselves in specific social conflicts, which in turn cannot be understood without this contradiction. One can expect, then, that the mode of forming compromises between fractions of capital, and it is mediated via the state apparatus, and of integrating the exploited and oppressed classes, will take on new forms in this historical process, and will therefore produce new levels of social conflict. Furthermore, it would be interesting to analyze along these lines the contradiction concerning partialization and homogenization of state apparatuses as indicated by Poulantzas. This contradiction, which assumes the shape of increasing supervision and control by security agencies, leads to major conflicts within political apparatuses. The capitalist state apparatus as a whole maintains partialization by segmenting itself into a multitude of different bureaucratic relations and political organizations, each with specific interrelationships to particular classes and class fractions. The state's partialization is based on a rather loose coordination of this segmented multitude. The emergence of the security state comes together with a strong homogenization of the state apparatus, resulting in a decrease of the relative autonomy of the particular organization of the political system. Consequently, for example, security agencies become increasingly, quote, states within the state, end quote. And in the parliamentary system, structural conflict emerges between the, quote, party within government, end quote, and the, quote, member party, end quote, especially in the case of social democratic parties, which produce strong and permanent inter-party conflicts. However, the main aspect concerning current changes on the level of the political system should be illustrated. The transformation of the unions and parties and the concomitant development of a new corporative structure, as well as changes in the arena of social conflicts. Although there is no room for a detailed analysis, an outline shall be drawn with questions that might lead to further research. Whereas I am mainly referring to developments in West Germany, certain aspects are typical for all advanced capitalist countries. The transformation of political parties into quasi-state apparatuses is mainly based on the Fordist restructuring of society. Because of the increasing capitalization of society resulting in social disintegration, the destruction of the traditional workers' community, the differentiation and fragmentation within the working class, the rise of a, quote, new middle class, end quote, and forced mobility, the parties have changed from organizations for political class consciousness. The parties have changed from organizations of political class interests to bureaucratic and mass integrative apparatuses. In contrast to traditional political parties, bourgeois as well as labor parties, these new parties are characterized by a distinct detachment from social relations and of experience, decreasing activities of members on the lower levels of organization, disappearance of, quote, party social life, end quote, especially in labor parties, and a simultaneous increase of bureaucratization. The modern mass parties appear as quasi-state apparatuses with a high degree of centralization, dominated by bureaucratic elites, and at the same time are characterized by a very nebulous social basis and program. Quote, people's parties, end quote. Typical traits include increasing juridical privileges, raising them to the level of constitutional organs, as well as increasing public financing, which in turn leads to a further alienation from their members. This development cannot be explained in the narrow sense of the sociology of formal organizations, Rather, it is based on the above-mentioned Fordistic changes in socialization and class structure. This change in the structure of the party system is further based on the fact that due to growing competition on the world market, processes of social and economic restructuring have to be accomplished by administrative means. The goal of state politics in most advanced capitalist countries is to gain competitive advantages on the world market for their national economies. The efforts made in this regard do not only concern certain sectoral policies, for e.g. the promotion of technology, but to a large degree become similar to structural policies encompassing the whole society. Changes in the international division of labor and in conditions of the realization of capital, therefore, influence national political decisions more directly on all levels, and dominance of the world market leads to a reduction in the realm of decision-making for, quote, national, end quote, governments. Thus, the changed function of the modern, quote, mass integrative parties, end quote, seems to be clear. They no longer function in the traditional sense, articulating and mediating different and opposing interest groups to the political decision-making agencies. Rather, they operate as regulative transmission agents between the state bureaucracy and the people affected by their measures. In order to stabilize dependency on a world market, massive integrative parties mediate the apparent constraints to the affected people, as they filter and channel people's demands and interests, making them compatible with the system's conditions. The Fordistic change of society is reflected in the parties as modern mass integrative agencies in a double sense. Their main social basis consists of rather disintegrated social relationships, while at the same time they are constituent parts of an administrative regulation apparatus which reaches deeper and deeper into the social fabric. Parties actually are an essential form of the statification of society. However, while their controlling function increases, their scope of action becomes more economically restricted. Consequently, the intensified competition of national capitalist formations on the world market narrows the scope for national class-related politics. This refers, for example, to the preservation of social security systems or to costly environmental protection measures within a worldwide tendency toward austerity politics. In this way, massive integrative parties are forced to control the articulation of interest groups, to manipulate public opinion, to forestall free forms of interest group organization, or to obstruct plebiscitarian forms of politics. These massive integrative parties tend to strengthen their political monopoly and work more and more as state apparatuses. Unions as well are characterized by similar structural changes. Because of identical social developments, they also become, in a modified way, mass integrative agencies. This transformation of unions and political parties is the basis of a political structure recently raised as a topic in the, quote, neo-corporatism debate. Their stratification and their ability to strongly control interest group articulation makes both unions and parties able to tie together to form a sort of bureaucratic regulation cartel and to establish a highly organized form of social contractual politics. With the rise of a corporative regulation cartel consisting of the integrative mass parties, the bureaucratic unions, employers' associations, and a state administration with broad social and economic regulating functions, a new structural mode of controlling capitalist class conflict has emerged. Within its frame, political and economic interest groups have grown into bureaucratic agencies to administer life chances. Political and economic interest groups focus on a more or less explicit working out of guidelines for a systems politics, the results of which have to be mediated with the respectively affected people. Representation of interests therefore gains a new form and a new content even by merely articulating certain interests representation is integrated into the imperatives of system stabilization and gets deflected on various levels through the integration of the interest organizations within the context of central administrative regulation. Regarding the successful social and economic stabilization within the advanced capitalist system, the proposition can be made that this, quote, neo-corporative, end quote, mode of social regulation is an essential precondition to achieve this end. For example, the rise of West Germany as a dominant imperialist center in the 60s, Modell Deutschland, seems to have been related to the successful establishment of the appropriate institutional and political structures. These structures facilitated the social and political management of a Fordist transformation. There is no time here to refer in detail to the historical conditions which were relevant for this change. The destruction of the labor movement by fascism and the existence of a traditionally strong and efficient bureaucratic state. These structures allowed for several achievements to occur. First, the continuity of production was secured against unplanned work stoppages or strikes. This was important as the technology of production was developed rapidly and the conditions of the international social division of labor had become a complicated one. Second, economic crises could be dealt with by political/administrative manipulation, e.g. by the shifting of crises of realization into the sphere of reproduction. For example, one could mention the advancing destruction of nature and environment with state aid in order to bring about profitable changes in the technology of production. This strategy was supported by unions as it guaranteed a basis to negotiate for higher wages. The question concerning the totality of material living conditions was thereby excluded. Unions have proven to be important assisting agents in achieving the Fordistic model of production and reproduction. Third, a relative stabilization of mass consumption was achieved, with a simultaneous limitation of wages and a stabilization of profits, mass consumption being the basis of a Fordistic way of realization of capital. The modern corporative regulation cartel actually was the political basis for the Keynesian policies suitable for realization, which could not have been established without disciplined unions. And finally, the economic processes of restructuring defined by the world market were carried through and led to intensification of labor, structural employment, dequalification, etc. These consequences were accepted by unions out of an interest in the economic stability of the general system and were supported with certain social modifications. As this kind of, quote, social contractual, end quote, form of social regulation became the essential political precondition for capitalism, highly advanced in technological terms, the importance of social democratic parties or similar parties increased. The crisis of these social democratic parties in a broad sense, therefore, coincides with the crisis of the Fordist form of socialization. They have supported this mode of socialization and of accumulation from the New Deal in the United States to the era of reform in West Germany in the late 60s, and with it are now facing profound difficulties. Section 4. The development which began with the worldwide economic crisis in the mid-1970s leads to the hypothesis that the Fordistic phase of capitalist development is coming to an end. This is indicated by the crisis of Keynesianism, the dismantling of the welfare state, strong reprivatization tendencies, as well as the abandonment of demands for social equality. The social and economic shifts that might result from this development and the possible consequences for the institutional structure and function of the state cannot be dealt with in this brief essay. I will focus here on specific critical moments of the Fordist political system which might indicate a disintegration and transformation of this mode of socialization. These moments of crisis mainly result from the fact that the corporatist system of mass integration excludes various interests which can no longer be handled within the political system. A major factor is the separation of mass integrative apparatuses from their social basis as well as their bureaucratic centralization. The system of political apparatuses therefore becomes rather insensitive and unresponsive to social interests and problems. Thus, larger parts of the population no longer feel truly represented. Hence, social conflicts and problems unfold outside of the bureaucratic sphere of control and perception, while the political apparatus's capacity to regulate is strengthened by the bureaucratization and statification of parties and unions. The capacity to process problems and the ability to perceive and mediate opposing social interests drastically decreases. Such problems and conflicts are systematically neglected, which means that they've remained virulent, even if in a new form. Furthermore, the establishment of the corporatist regulation cartel brings about a tendency to split and fragment society. Individuals and interests which are deemed irrelevant for economic purposes are systematically excluded from society. Old and sick people, people who do not adjust, adolescents and immigrant workers. The form of political organization described above increases and intensifies this division of society, mainly caused by its strong integration into the world market, into a, quote, modern, end quote, section on the one hand, and a marginal section or an internal periphery on the other hand. In the first section, we find a social core with economic privileges that finds itself represented by the corporatist system and consists of technologically advanced capital, part of a new middle class, and skilled workers. In the marginal section, we find unskilled workers, disabled persons, and dropouts, those capital fractions which are threatened by structural change, the physically and psychically handicapped, and those who are worn out by the labor process. At the same time, non-productivist interests like those in a healthy environment or in natural ecology are marginalized within and across individual people. An example would be the justification for the destruction of the cities and of the natural environment by pointing to secure employment, as is the case in the nuclear and automobile industries. Here lies the material basis for the recent discussion of the so-called, quote, change of values, end quote. Because of this development, social conflicts still result from the context of capitalist exploitation, yet they do not manifest themselves along traditional class lines, nor can such conflicts find expression within the system of political apparatuses, because they are structurally excluded. The political system is very limited in its ability to deal with social problems, and a frequency of social and political crises might easily overstrain this capacity despite the system's apparent external stability. As a consequence of this changed structure of social and political conflict, the oppositions between the established apparatuses, i.e. between parties, administrative bureaucracy, and unions, seem to decrease. Dull political public debates and uninteresting election campaigns are indications. Moreover, new levels of conflicts come to the fore. First, conflicts occur between the bureaucratic apparatus and between members within the mass integrative parties. These conflicts become more frequent and more significant as these apparatuses are increasingly forced to oppose the interests of their members and constituencies as they attempt to stabilize the system. Arguments within the party's wings become more important than the opposition between the parties. Conflicts over internal democracy and unions and the right to strike become more important than the ritualized and bureaucratically mediated negotiations between union elites and employer associations. The more such conflicts are suppressed within the hegemonic institutions and the more mass integrative institutions do not tolerate open dissent, the more significant these conflicts become. Second, It follows then that a new level of conflict develops between the corporatistically unified political apparatus as a whole and extra-institutional social movements forming an opposition. The rigid and opaque structure of the political system promotes the rise of these movements, which try to articulate and accomplish neglected needs and interests. As they do not correspond to the established system's notions of functional logic, they necessarily and frequently without intention are in opposition to it. These, quote, new social movements, end quote, find expression in several citizens' initiatives, in the ecology movement, as well as spontaneous strikes or the occupation of factories. The changed structure of the political system of domination as a product of the changed form of the capitalist mode of socialization implies new ways of expression and new possibilities of opposition between relevant parts of the population and the state apparatus. In advanced capitalist countries, this opposition is expressed by an anti-bureaucratic sentiment and a, quote, discontent with the political system, end quote, but also by several radicalizing grassroots movements, quote, second society, end quote. In reaction to these emerging social movements, new modes of ideological legitimation have to be found, such as possibly a reactionary anti-bureaucratic mass mobilization, which paradoxically are brought about by the agents and executives of the political apparatuses themselves, such as an essential element in the strategy of Reagan, Thatcher, and Strauss. The repressive protection of the established apparatuses therefore becomes increasingly important. From this point of view, one can understand the suppression and criminalization of ultra-democratic extra-institutional movements, the rigid surveillance of all kinds of social and political, quote, deviance, end quote, as well as Berufsverbote, which means the systematic and legalized keeping of, quote, radical persons, end quote, out of the civil services. Although highly developed in West Germany, these tendencies are not only due to particular national characteristics and traditions, but are also a result of the advanced Fordistic form of political and social organization which also occurs elsewhere. One has to keep in mind, however, that it is just this transformation of social structures and the corresponding form of political organization that has led to the rise of these new social movements and which allows for new ideas of politics and of social emancipation and development to unfold. The security state, therefore, is not as strong as it seems to be. However, these movements are quite ambivalent and diffuse in ideology and difficult to assess in their social character. One cannot refute that alternative movements might function as a moment in the integrative stabilization of the Fordistic division of society and hence prove to be a functional correlate for corporatist regulation. Just as well, one might argue that their inherent tendencies for destatification, self-management, and direct representation of interests might be regarded as a stabilizing counter-movement to guarantee the autonomization that otherwise might be threatened by the advancing process of Fordistic statification. There are no safe predictions to be made concerning revolutionary certainties, today even less so than previously. However, we must acknowledge that with the development of capitalist society and its structural changes, the inherent conflicts and antagonisms have changed their form, their agents, and their course. Therefore, we have to bid farewell to some anachronistic conceptions of politics and class struggle. Furthermore, we must come to a clear understanding of the trends in social development and of changes within capitalist formations. Only then can we realize the relevance of movements and conflicts and the conditions for social revolutionary politics in today's society, and only then will we be ready for political action.